Welcome everybody, welcome especially to our newcomers, our first-timers, our recently returned folks, people coming to check out our community. It is wonderful to have you all here with us, of course together with the stalwarts who make up our community week to week. As I said, this week we had a special Haftorah chanted for us by Francine from the book of Jeremiah. It's the first of what are called the Haftorahs of Rebuke that lead up to Tisha B'Av. But Pinchas is normally paired with a different Haftorah from the book of Kings, and that's actually some of the dynamic I want to talk about today. One of my favorite new features of Mark Zuckerberg's dystopian world, in which many of us participate, Facebook, is the Memories tab, which allows you to look back at what you posted on a particular day, going back over the course of many years. And sometimes it is such a record of such sweet and sometimes forgotten moments to scroll back through and see faces and relive special times. Sometimes it is a reminder of sad or difficult times. And a great deal of time, I look at what I posted years ago, and it leaves me just sort of scratching my head, wondering what in the world might have been going on that might have precipitated such a post. At the start of this week, I was scrolling through Memories, and out popped a post which was just a quote from my mother, which said, "Adam, if you're going to insist on talking to yourself, at least try to have an intelligent conversation." Mom, I don't know what you were exactly referring to, but there are really endless possibilities of what that could have been about. And I do appreciate the reminder that at least one of the benefits of talking to oneself is the chance that one might have an intelligent conversation. Our textual tradition does the same thing. It talks to itself and sometimes has brilliant conversations, one text with another. Sometimes those texts share different points of view, and they even directly challenge one another's assumptions. And I find that quite often it's in that productive and meaningful and sometimes quite subversive tension between our sacred texts that the greatest truths are to be found. One such tension animates the two liturgical readings that typically go together for Parashat Pinchas. In this Parsha, as I have mentioned, at the start of it, we enter in midway to a story about Pinchas, the great-nephew of Moses, who's engaged in an act of vigilante violence. The Israelites are in the midst of a plague brought down by God as penance for rampant acts of immorality. And Pinchas, moved with zeal, captures a couple of violators and executes them brutally with a spear going through both of them, sort of a shish kebabbing kind of an action. It is a dark moment in the Torah. But in fact, when God is asked to weigh in on Pinchas' action, God offers Pinchas praise. Pinchas is rewarded with God's eternal covenant of peace, God's brit shalom, sort of an ironic offering to a man who is very much not a man of shalom. The eternal brit shalom, the eternal covenant of peace and priesthood. And clearly his actions are favored by the divine because this decisive, bloody act puts an immediate stop to further dying. And calm is restored in the Israelite camp. God in the Torah praised Pinchas, but I would suspect that most of us instinctively recoil from acts of brutal zealotry. We have to believe that that isn't the only way that order and peace might be restored. We are frankly horrified by the idea of one man, any man, taking it upon himself to act as judge, jury, and executioner. And what I find so empowering in this internal conversation between our texts is that I believe that we are not alone in that reaction. That reaction is not just one of squeamish moderns, but actually a conversation about the nature of zealotry and of the threat of religious violence that extends back millennia. 2,000 years ago, when the rabbis of the Talmud went through the books of prophets and selected haftarot, those texts that would be paired with the weekly Torah portion, They generally selected texts that would bolster or amplify the message of the Torah that we had just read, that would share a theme or underline a point, except for this week. This week they do something subtle, and if we're paying attention, I believe quite profound. They pair the story of Pinchas with the well-known tale of Elijah. Elijah, who was for most of his life another believer in the power of violence to get his point across. And elsewhere in the Talmud, they actually talk about Elijah as the reincarnation of Pinchas in his generation. Our reading picks up after a particularly dramatic scene where Elijah has personally put to the sword 700 pagan priests, following a great religious contest that takes place at the foot of the Carmel mountain. Elijah is now on the run for this crime of executing all of these pagan priests, beloved of the queen at the time named Jezebel. Elijah is on the run, chased far into the desert to flee retribution. He runs as far, the Bible tells us, as Mount Sinai, the place, of course, where all of our stories begin. And there at Sinai, he encounters God, who teaches him a life-changing lesson. As Elijah hides in the cave, there are all of these incredible forces that pass before him. There is thunder and lightning and whirlwind and fire. The entire mountain shakes with the force of a mighty earthquake. But the text teaches us that God is absent from all of these manifestations of nature's power. Then finally, after all of the spectacle of nature's might and danger, comes a kol demama daka, a still, small voice, a sound just barely more than silence. Elijah, who had always put his faith in a God of power and dominance, is stunned to realize that God is absent from the fire, not present in the whirlwind, not there with all of the explosions and fury. Instead, Elijah is being taught, and through him us, that the God of the universe is to be found in the quiet, soft, gentle voice that echoes in the heart. My friends, I believe that the rabbis deliberately chose this Haftorah to serve as a radical countertext to the dangers of Pinchas. Together, these texts engage in a profound public conversation about who we are and what it is we value. It may at times appear, as it did to Pinchas, that the only answer to our challenges lies in the sword. But, says God to Elijah, that's not where holiness dwells. We read Parashat Pinchas here in the height of the summer, but again, in the depths of the winter, we return to the same strategy and the same theme. On the Shabbat of Hanukkah, when we celebrate the military might of the Maccabees who descended from the hills like hammers to wipe out their Greek enemies, what Haftarah did the rabbi select for us? The words of Zechariah, who says, "Not by might and not by power, but by my Spirit shall you live." On that Shabbat, in the midst of a military victory celebration, we read, "Not by might and not by power." Our rabbis were not pacifists. They taught that when one rises to kill you, kill them first. But neither were they willing to follow their Roman neighbors in glorifying battle or fetishizing death. Violence may sometimes be necessary in self-defense or to combat a great evil, but necessary is not the same thing as holy. Necessary is not the same thing as sacred. I often think of the blessed memory of one of our people's recent heroes, Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's fallen prime minister and its greatest soldier of peace. Rabin spent a lifetime leading armies into the fiercest of fights to achieve noble goals. And in his last years, he said again and again to anyone who would listen, That a true soldier is not defined by their capacity to fight. A true soldier is defined by their constant and unending prayers for peace. In the belief, hard won and closely witnessed, that success does not look like dominance and triumph. Success looks like a world in which such things are no longer necessary, in which no one needs to fall in the pursuit of such aims. Rabbi met his end at the hands of a zealot, one who spoke openly and often in the brutal lead-up to his actions about being inspired by the example of Pinchas, who saw himself as a modern zealot. May we instead be students of our sages, who insisted that a parsha that seems to glorify violence must immediately be followed by a prophetic warning that God is not in the fire. May we, like them, challenge the idea that violence is the path to peace, and instead seek the voice of conscience that whispers in all our ears, calling, begging, that we find a new way forward together. In the words of the psalm that we sang last night, Adonai oz li'amo yiten, Adonai yivarach et amo v'shalom. God may grant God's people strength, but God's blessing is always a blessing of shalom, of peace. Eni hi ratzon, Shabbat shalom.